So we really wanted to leave this time open for questions or comments or thoughts from the audience about any of the individual programs or also cross-cutting issues across programs.
What's striking in listening to all these presentations is how many similarities there are across these interventions in terms of what works and what's effective. But I think I'm very mindful of the fact that we are very different many times from the families that we work with. And Dana's team talked about culture explicitly. And I guess I wonder, what is the role of culture in the success of these interventions? Like, how much attention needs to be paid to that, right? Given that it seems like if you're a warm, responsive parent, that works in every culture, right? So how much is that important? And then what are the implications of that for professional development of whoever it is delivering these programs, and where these interventions ultimately live in terms of their scalability? Should they live in schools? Should they live in community agencies? Should they live in universities? You know, those are things I'm wondering. And I bring this up that because I was involved with an implementation of family checkup with the Air Force, and when I heard where it was going to live, where they were going to house it, I was like, this will never work, because this is a stigmatized entity that nobody goes to voluntarily, right? And sure enough, nobody went, right? And so that's just an example of what I'm talking about.
Well, I'll respond to that. I don't know how that implementation went, actually, but I agree with what you're saying. I do think it's really important where it's housed and who it draws in. In the early days of the family checkup, it was much more of a targeted intervention focused on children at risk. And we absolutely moved from that model to providing it to everyone in a school system, regardless of risk, and being much more inclusive of who uses it. I think that's one piece. I think it's very challenging to tell people they can only have something if they're at risk in some certain way, and I've moved away from doing that at all, actually. I think in terms of the family checkup, probably all our interventions are so tailored, really, when you come down to it, that tailoring how it's delivered and the content that people use is really dependent on culture and values. And that's what makes a program like the family checkup, at least, amenable to different cultures, because it's not subscribed. It's not like you're going to complete these 12 sessions no matter what. You're going to do an evaluation, and then it's going to be adapted to what your needs are based on your situation, your culture, your values, your strengths. So that's key. Another point.
I would echo that the getting ready approach is very much about the first thing that we do is come together and talk about what is important to you, what's important to your family, what strengths do you bring to the table. It's a very strength-based approach. And we, I think implicit in all of that, inherent in all of that is really meeting with families with where they're at and helping them achieve the goals that they have for their child. And we do a lot of that in the training that we have with educators. I didn't talk at all about professional development model. I think that's an important thing that we heard from you. But it is very much integrated into how we begin talking with educators about relationships with families and connections with families. And I think we have to do that. I think we have to really be willing to listen and hear what families are saying about their realities, their expertise, what they bring to the table, what they hope and dream for their child. And that's, like I said, if we don't have that, we're always probably, if they don't think we really care about them as a family, as a person, as an individual, we're already at a very, very significant disadvantage. At least in our approach.
Yeah, I think there are like two parts to your question too, because there's the culture part and the context. I'm going to speak to the context part for a minute. The context that these programs developed in are quite different. So in parent core, where you have an urban context, majority of families of color, and pre-kindergartens in your schools, you're able to bring these parent groups together. Whereas if you're working, for example, with Head Start, or the way pre-K is done in Pennsylvania, there are a few school districts that run their own pre-K, but most of our school districts don't. Pre-K is contracted out to different agencies. We have a lot of community providers. Anyways, we don't have the connectedness between pre-K and K that you do. And those of you in Pennsylvania know the population is very varied by what part of Pennsylvania you're in. And so I think that was partly why we went with the home visit approach, where we could hire local providers in local communities that we felt could connect well with the families in those communities. But this connection and the tailoring is all done individually. So there might be some combination of sort of where you are and then how can you structure your program in a way to create those elements, but that represents the fact, well, how could you get families to come to you? I think in many of our rural schools, they just couldn't handle the transportation costs of getting parents to a school for a group meeting. So there might be some, there's like there's the level of culture, and then there's just this context of how could you really make this work? Now, what we haven't done is how we're going to get over the barrier of home visiting is very expensive too, and our travel costs are huge. So, anyways, it's just that element that crosses over.
I agree that context matters tremendously. I guess a couple of thoughts. We chose to place culture at the center from the beginning so that it was explicitly part of the conversation, along with the evidence base and along with other aspects of that are similar to other group-based parenting interventions to support behavior change. I think for us, it felt really important to honor culture, to bring it in as something that we believe matters to parents as a part of our identity and also as part of what affects parenting choices, and so give permission for that to be part of the conversation. I think in our own personal and organizational evolution, we now feel like it's essential to talk about race and racism as a part of that, and that really is evolution post VRCTs and the evidence base. That's something that we believe now is essential. The other thing is we're really, our history is a group focused on parenting. We always had the child group component, so it was really a family program. And at first we kind of thought about schools as like the venue. And we knew that we wanted to engage and train teachers and school staff to co-facilitate, and we really thought about that as a way for the program to be sustainable and live on in that venue. But in our first trial, that was kind of the extent of it. And we weren't thinking about trying to change classrooms. And then work between the first and second trial, we really built out the professional development piece. We added one-on-one coaching and consultation with teachers, and really thought, here we are. This is an incredible opportunity and responsibility to engage with teachers and kind of broaden out our theory of change at that point. And I think that very much holds true for us, that we feel like, yes, embedding a parenting intervention in a school is an incredible thing to do in terms of reach and making it accessible and taking away the stigma because it's right here and it's part of pre-K for everyone. And we think it's an incredible responsibility being in schools to help transform this broader context and to help race and culture be part of what we recognize affects lived experiences and interactions every day.
I do think based on that experience, so that culture and context are often linked, right? And so like what you were saying, Karen, about our situation with the rural families being far apart, that's a logistical barrier that that needs to be recognized, right? But there's also cultural barriers like implementing family checkup in the FAP program, which everybody in the military stays away from, right? And I think it would have been better to have had that conversation upfront and recognize that cultural problem, right, or difference, or whatever you want to call it, and do it somewhere else, right? So I do think context and culture are linked, and I also think culture and professional development are linked, because how are you going to train people to be culturally aware?
Well, I think in responding to that, the culture of schools too is another culture. And when we did our goal 4 and implemented the family checkup in schools, 40 middle schools in Oregon, I mean, we really came across the culture of schools and how some schools are very interested in creating more family engagement and having more programs that reach out to parents. And in other schools, and these schools were randomly assigned intervention, of course, that would be the worst possible thing they could think of doing. And no staff person in the building or anywhere near the building wanted to speak to parents under any conditions. So you're dealing, that's a school culture, I mean, really. And it's a culture of not wanting to engage with families versus a culture of wanting to engage. And obviously those two types of schools are going to implement something like the family checkup completely differently. And so I think that's really important.
I just want to add on to that briefly. We feel like we have to wrestle with that, or else implementation of our evidence-based program will only have legs in some places.
Right.
And that's hard. The hybrid effectiveness implementation trials that we're doing now, we have a much broader range, many more schools and early education centers, and a much broader range in leaders' interest and readiness and the kind of variation in culture that you're talking about. I also just want to add on briefly, I don't think we feel like we know at all how to support cultural competence in professional learning, like that we've cracked that nut. But we think it's part of what we need to be trying to do, and we're working with our own trainers and consultants to build in protocol for courageous conversations about race, for example, to have that be part of what we think is necessary to do this purpose. Yeah.
So with the Ready PD program, I was particularly fascinated by the finding related to parent-child conversations.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that was measured. Were you looking at frequency of conversation? Were you looking at quality of conversation? And then extending that to everybody else on the panel, to what extent do the other programs emphasize conversation and focus on that as a piece of the puzzle?
So the measure we had of that was not something we would have thought was a very strong measure. It's a parent report of items like, how easy is it for you to get your child to tell you about their day? How long are your conversations with your child? So it was really their perceptions of how well they could help their child talk with them about their thoughts and feelings. It's not a measure I would have betted would have the kind of power that it did, but I think as it turned out, it's something parents can report on. We have no idea if their conversations were actually longer, but that feeling that it was easier for them to communicate with their child and to really have meaningful talks with them, I think that turned out to be a really important index of their skills, the child's skills, something about the relationship. And I'll mention we had a lot of scaffolded activities. So there were a number of scripted books that helped you have prompts that elicited talk. There were a number of games that were sort of, pick a card and talk about that. So I think it was also supported by a lot of activities that made it easy for parents to get a feeling of the kinds of questions they could ask that a 4 to 5-year-old could respond to and build on.
And that would be a very common goal in our approach, where when parents and teachers are coming together and talking about what dreams they have and how we might start working together and selecting some and pinpointing some goals to start focusing on. it is responsibility too of the teacher, if you're the child educator, to help the parent understand what are some appropriate goals. It's not a total sort of open-ended thing and sort of whatever, sort of among the many of things you want to do, let's do this. It's much more structured around some good developmentally appropriate practices and goal setting for children. So that would be a very common one, that language development, vocabulary development, and a strategy that would be used then across the classroom and across the home settings would be to engage in conversations with the child and really help the parent understand how to create that reciprocal sort of two-way exchange that is carried on over the course of a couple of exchanges, and learning about using natural experiences in the home to enrich a child's vocabulary and language. And so it's very much embedded in what we do in the approach, but we don't have the structured books and the scripted questions. It's very much taking advantage of the natural environment and helping parents see how everyday experiences can be learning experiences. We need to do a better job measuring those things. We also need to do a better job measuring actually what is the uptake. What are parents taking to heart, and how are they changing their practice with their child. So those are those mechanisms that we still are grappling with.
I have a question in particular for Parent Corps. I've been struggling to figure out how to phrase this question, but I thought it was really interesting that you guys address cultural differences that you can't always see, for example, sexuality, and in particular immigration status. So my question is more about how you guys embrace outreach and recruitment for sensitive topics that require the families to self-disclose, especially when there's a lot of hostility around these topics, especially because I imagine the trust comes once they come, but beforehand, how you recruit.
I want to respond to a piece of that. That long list of characteristics that I said, this is the broad definition of culture that we embrace. We put that out there in session 1 and session 2 as please share whatever you choose to share that's important to how you identify. So there's definitely not an expectation that parents would disclose their immigration status, for example. But we're wanting to, again, kind of put it on the table and say that it's safe to talk about these things here, and that these things are important to each of us in different ways. You are in your end of the experiences you have. And we've shifted that language in those first couple of sessions. That's one of the places that we go back to tweak to be really thoughtful about making it more and more possible for people to talk about sexuality or gender identity, for example, so that's an okay part of this conversation, but always, as Dana said, challenge by choice, that it's always up to participants to decide what it's going to be. Kai, do you want to add a little bit about outreach and how it shows up there?
It's in general, outreach is challenging no matter what. When we are trying to onboard schools or trying to get schools who are interested in a program to come, it's hard in general. I'm losing my train of thought. But it's hard in general to get parents to come. What I usually say, and I'm going to speak from the first person as somebody who was supporting, who actually worked in school getting parents to come, because I'm connecting it to the culture of the school in general. So do parents feel good when they walk into the building? And people don't disclose all of those personal things up front. They sort of got to come into the space and feel as if they can. So we don't ask up front to people to disclose who they are and all of their sensitive information, but we work with, for example, from coming to the trainings, I wanted to create a space where people felt comfortable to share exactly who they were. And then I was, from the training, asked to withhold my personal judgments so that I can make space for the parent, which is really, really hard. That takes a lot of deep thought, a lot of self-reflection. What do I believe? What are my beliefs? How am I encroaching my beliefs on the parents when they are coming into a space? And how do I understand that in myself enough to halt that? Everybody can't do that because that is your real self and your real stuff. The only way you can do it is if you are beginning to change your own beliefs. From the training, some of my beliefs changed. Am I doing this right? What do I really believe in? All my beliefs fair? Can I have an open space where parents can come no matter what, if they're gay, no matter what their religions are, no matter how they show up? How am I creating that open space? That is always a battle. And now we're working with other mental health professionals to even have them, and these are like social workers who already believe that they're open, that they're liberal, that they make spaces, and then when they do their own self-reflection, it's like, no, you're not. And that's why the parents are not showing up, because they can't be their true selves. And then how do you get them to change their practice if they're not even open in the space enough to say, this is actually what I'm struggling with. If I'm hiding what I'm struggling with, who I really am and how I'm parenting, I can't help you change your parenting practice because you don't feel comfortable enough to tell me what your real struggle is. It's like one of the hardest sessions is about spanking. If you come into a space and the first thing I say is spanking is wrong, you shouldn't do it, and there you go. If that's my first statement as a mental health professional, I can't help any of these parents if they're really spanking their kids, and I want to support them trying out something different, because they're not going to tell me their truth, because I already told them from the very beginning it was wrong and you shouldn't be doing it. So how do we, it's really about, and it's very complicated, creating an open space, withholding judgments. That's why we say our judgments, our values, our assumptions, they matter, because people believe that people are not even in tune with their own true values and assumptions. That's why we do the activities. Stop and think what your values are. Because you can say your value is, oh, I'm open and I'm transparent. I can see your value whether or not you say it. After a while, I get to know you, I can tell you what your value are. You can believe but you live those values. So it's a very challenging metric to do. We just hope that we can create a space where parents feel comfortable enough to say, this is who I am and this is what I believe, and then we can help them come to the decision themselves to change what they feel like they want to.
Okay, you got me really jazzed up now. So, what I'm thinking is all that work is so, like, it's sort of like altruistic, right? It's up there on the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we're talking about really low income families, and frankly, a really low income workforce that often doesn't have health insurance, that may or may not have been able to have the privilege to go to college. You know, if they did go to college, they may have taken out a ton of loans that they're struggling to pay back on their really low income salary. So I'm curious about if you've been able to tease out any of those questions related to, like, income for the families, like when we say low income, like what does that really mean? Like, is there variation? Is there like really, really poor homeless families, or are there like working poor families, you know, and like what's the correlation of that on your effects? And then also, what's the correlation of how well funded the centers are that you're working in terms of effects?
Can I just say one thing to that? And a lot in our training sessions that we have, some are teachers in the New York City school system, and some are teachers in independent pre-K centers. A lot of the early training is often just hearing the teachers and the family workers, and the teaching assistants, hearing them out about what their struggles are, about where they live, about what their stuff is. Because again, people can't uptake changing their teaching practice if they don't feel heard themselves. So it is a lot of, what's your stuff? What are your issues? I hear you. And it's a system. There's tools that we that we do, in fact, and then we teach, like reflection, just being quiet and listening. Some of it's just charting all the stuff. Turn to your neighbor and you share your context in your school and all of the challenges that you have. We ask what are the challenges families face, but then we ask what are the challenges you face, because until they get all of that out, they can't hear anything. I've sat in so many professional developments, and they tell, as a teacher, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. And you're like, okay, sure. I have all, because I can't, this is hard, I'm doing this, I can't do this, I don't make enough money, I don't. And so until that's heard and validated, you can't hear anything else. So a lot of it in the very beginning is just hearing out the struggles of the workforce and what it takes to do the work and validating them. Because a lot of people, they want to do the work, and it's important to them.
I was wondering if
this is for everyone. If you have an idea in mind of what the ideal like, level of scale up would be, so is it working directly with schools, or would it be going up to a district level, or city or state? I mean, do you have an idea of what might be like the ideal level that you think your program could move up to, and maybe going a little bit further might not? You're going to a state level might not work well for your program.
I was just going to say, I think schools and districts are organized very differently across states. Districts tend to have a lot of autonomy, so there's few states that could compel districts to use particular programs. They can compel them to say, you have to have something in the area of family engagement. And depending on the district you're in, sometimes the district is mandating programming like this, and sometimes principals are making their own choices. You guys had a very unique situation in New York City, and Boston had a very unique situation where there was a big citywide commitment to pre-K. But I think that question it's really hard to say. I mean, wouldn't we love every place to have the kind of commitment that then you still have the challenging job of making it happen, but you had a commitment to this as a topic. But the reality is, I think probably each of us are dealing in states, districts, schools where the decision making is in different hands in different places. So you watch some programs that say, I'm going to go for the district level, but that can be, unless you have a team like this that's doing a heck of a lot of work at individual schools, it's hard to get high fidelity and buy-in at the school level. So it's a very complicated question. It's a good question, but I think it's actually a very complicated set of considerations of what kind of buy-in at what level does it take for your program to work well, and what's the likelihood of getting that. Like if you started at the top, would you be able to get the level of on the ground buy-in that you'd need for it?
I agree with everything that you said. Just a couple thoughts I'll add. We think there's real value in bringing pre-K and school leaders together across sites, in part for the reason Kai described, of just giving folks a chance to share with each other the struggle and to get support. We think having district level buy-in and investment matters, and it definitely doesn't make everything else easy. And we do continue to do a lot of site-by-site, school-by-school coaching and support. And it's hard for me to imagine that would ever not be needed.
In our case, it is a way of doing business for our educators. So with all families, their approach, is changing. So on the surface, it doesn't look like it would be a high cost, and it should be generalizable. And we work with agencies, we work with schools, private and public center-based programs. And so at that systems level, it is important, we think, to really sort of try to really spread the intervention. The cost comes in with all the coaching, and we really think that is imperative. And I talked a little about fidelity and what that even means and how we measure it and all that. That's where I think we really need to better understand what it really takes and at what level, and taking it to scale. Lisa's doing quite a bit of work with the Nebraska State Department of Education, with South Dakota Department of Education, and others in the region to really look statewide at some of our, especially Part C providers, and how they can uptake the approach in their programs. And I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking it's the case that whoever that decision maker is, or the key stakeholder, and sort of their the spread of their control, if you will, what sites they influence. So in the state of Nebraska, Part C services for infants and toddlers with disabilities, they have some professional development and oversight statewide, and so that's allowed us to go in, implement something in a broader space than a district alone, working in partnership with school districts, but depending on the limitations of that stakeholders' purview, put some parameters around this scale of effort, I think.
I think it would be interesting for us also to tackle training our workforce differently. This is something I've been interested in. I'm in a college of education, and wouldn't it be, I mean, this is a research I do, we can never do, but would it be interesting to take a cohort of teacher educators and train those people in all the curriculums and stuff they need, and how to interact with and engage families in schools? And then train like another cohort just to have them get teaching, training as usual, and just look at how that impacts child outcomes over time, something like that. I think the reason I think about that is because when we work in schools, often if there's a school counselor, that's the person that's assigned us. And so we always think, well, it's going to be 50-50 chance this person will want to work with families. A lot of the school counselors we encounter who've been through kind of a master's in school counseling program are trained to get in an office with an individual child and do something. And they actually have no training, never even took a course in parent training, talking to parents, working with families. And so to try to take that person with no background and tell them, oh, guess what, all that training you had, now you're going to be doing something completely different that you never were trained to do. That's really hard, really up against something with that, versus looking at our school counseling programs nationwide and saying, we're going to start training this workforce in a totally different way to meet these demands and to do some more evidence-based interventions with kids across the lifespan that focus more on engaging families. That's the way to approach it.
I was thinking about Pennsylvania and other states now that are requiring within their early childhood assessment this family engagement piece. This is something that's being assessed now. This is something that's being looked at as part of your policy rating system, STAR system here in Pennsylvania. And I think there are more conversations. It's sort of like as we were discussing this alignment of entities that have the power, this P3 alignment. There's a lot more discussion going on, I think, about P3 alignment, what that means, family engagement. And I think some of the conversations and systems are beginning to change in states. I think there's still a long way to go, but I do think some of those structures are starting to change that may make it a little bit easier to get toes in doors or, move things forward a little bit.
I completely agree. At least here, there's intensive interest. Schools are really interested, and I shared some statistics about the fact that schools know they can't meet their Title I requirements. It's hard for them to meet ESSA standards, but at the same time, the challenges, the resources, and the training and the funding they would need to run any of these programs, right? And so there's the complication. And so I think many are just trying to make do. We'll do a parent workshop day because we can manage that. It's hard, right? And I think part of that is on us, that we do need to kind of discussion we're having. How could we scale these? What can we streamline them in any way? Can we find ways to make them more cost effective? And then the other is then connecting, the challenge of sort of systemic issues.
So I might be the only one in the room who feels this way, but the term taking it to scale, or that phrase, seems a little nebulous to me. So how do we know when our programs have gone to scale? Like, how do we know when that has actually been achieved? What are we looking for? What are the criterion or things like that?
A lot of it is really, the degree to which our programs can be infused into everyday practice. And it has to do with adaptability and fit. And there's this balancing act between the systems that we're trying to influence and the programs that we're trying to implement. We can't just continue to try to get our programs to fit into a system, the way they're currently structured. We can't really expect that we're going to totally modify this system in order to accommodate this complicated set of conditions that need to be in place in order to say the intervention is in place. So it's this constant struggle between fit and function, you know, and to the degree to which we can learn how to grapple with that and then implement a program in ways that really does kind of work within the natural environments within which, you know, children are experiencing their educational programming and teachers are, you know, delivering programs in their classrooms and interfacing with families in the natural sort of set of conditions within which they're responsible for. It's not answering your question at all, I understand that. And what I'm really doing is probably saying out loud how complex that question really is.
It's a great question.
I think it's like brushing your teeth.
Yeah.
Toothbrushing is pretty well scalable. Everyone does it, right? It's a really simple, small, right? And like, how can we really take some of these concepts to that kind of scale?
Right. So I guess my thinking is more like, you know, I mean, I think we probably all on a theoretical level would love to see our programs be saturate the entire U.S. and beyond, right? But realistically, that may not ever happen. I don't want to be pessimistic. It could happen, it could, but realistically, maybe not. So, like, I don't know, maybe it's a self-efficacy is really important. So maybe it's an efficacy part on my part. But like, how do I know when it's like, you can kind of pat your team on the back and say, hey, I think we actually made a milestone here. This is, and then I guess it becomes a question of too, like, should we be scaling programs or should we be figuring out what the common components are, the active ingredients, and we should be scaling those instead of programs?
So,
I don't know.
we're actually now running out of time, but I feel like this is a great question to end on, because what our goal was in this symposium was really to highlight these 4 model programs that are in the process of trying to figure out where should you go with scaling. And I think you're phrasing the question, what would the ultimate vision be? Should it be programs or practices? How would you match programs with appropriate contexts and cultures? I mean, there's such a myriad of sub-questions within that. So I do realize that we are out of time, and so I want to thank you all for your participation. I really want to thank our speakers again for coming, and hopefully this will be the start of good conversations and future interaction about these important issues.